The latest one had to do with whether these precautions that we've been taking, some of them, like social distancing and masking, those are two of the, favorites, actually did anything. Did they actually work? Were they meaningful ways to, quote, stop the spread? And what did you opine? What did you find? And then we'll talk about the reaction.
So COVID, like so many things in America today, COVID has just become so polarized, right? And so the partisan point on one side is masking doesn't work at all. It's all irrelevant. And the partisan talking point on the other side is, if only we wear our masks enough and are diligent enough, we can stop the spread of COVID. And when you actually look at the data, the truth ends up falling into neither one of those camps. So masking does work in the sense that there are repeated studies that show if you and I are in an indoor place having a conversation and one of us has COVID and we're not masked, we're more likely to get it than if one of us has COVID and we are masked. The question is, how big is that effect? And I think that a lot of Americans, predominantly on the political left, have come to think that masking is sort of everything. And yet, when you look at the data, you actually see that during the Omicron wave, masking doesn't seem to have had a huge effect. And as technical and as complicated as all this stuff is, you don't have to actually dig into incredibly fine data to get the main point, which is when you look at a city like Seattle or a city like San Francisco or a city like Boston, where there has been much, much more masking, when people have been going into the office less, when they've been eating out much, much less, relative to cities like Charlotte and Tampa, and even Austin, Texas, which we think of as a liberal city, but is in Texas. There have been huge differences in how much people are masking and how much people are eating in restaurants, but the difference in how much COVID spread there was is really difficult to find. And so it looks like that Omicron is just so contagious that the kind of masking that we've done has a small effect, but only a small effect.
Mm-hmm. It's like we masked back up when Delta hit, and then we just never unmasked. We just never paused again to say, wait, does this make sense? Do we need to be doing this?
Yes. And I think it may have made sense at the height of the Omicron wave, because again, I know some people disagree with this, probably some of your listeners. But look, masking, there's a reason why doctors wear masks in hospitals. There's a reason why Asia, which is dealt with, there's a reason why Asia, which has dealt with these sort of contagious flus more in the last 30 years than other regions, there's a reason why people there think masking can make sense. Masking really can work. Omicron was so contagious that it had only a small effect. When our hospitals are full, when we're really at a crisis point, a small effect, I would argue, is worth it. But when that's not the case, and it's not the case now, our hospitals are not full anymore, I do think there's really a question of, is masking worth the downsides? Is it worth the fact that every single conversation you have is harder when you're wearing a mask? Is it worth the fact that, I know you've pointed this out when I've been on your show before, your glasses fog? Is it worth the fact that it's harder to communicate for kids with learning disabilities? Is it worth the fact that it's harder to communicate for people who are hard of hearing? And so it's just hard. Every form of communication is harder. I quoted an expert, I think she's a psychologist, who said basically talking with a mask on is like having a cell phone conversation when you're in a bad service area. And so is that worth it when our hospitals aren't full and the effect is small? I think that's highly debatable.
Well, and also I'll tell you, so we're in Montana because my kids are on spring break. And one of the inappropriate things we did while here was I showed them the movie Contagion, with Matt Damon, Gwyneth Paltrow, and Jude Law. And totally, I said, we're going to watch something definitely inappropriate and disturbing. And they said, cool.
They're kids.
I mean, and I never would have showed that to them during the middle of the pandemic. But now that we're at the place we're at, I could put it in perspective and they could understand. Because there's just so many things in that movie that are predictive of how things would go, during the pandemic we just went through, like how people would react and what we would do and so on and so forth. But if we had a disease like that one, right, where it was like a 30% death rate, 30% of the people who get it are going to die, people would have been masked to the nth degree in every setting. There wouldn't have been pushback by parents to the masking in school. People would have been genuinely scared blankness and less, and would have complied, I think, a lot more quickly and happily and, without complaint. But the very fact that, especially with respect to children, we, thank God, did not have that in COVID, is what I think led people to get to their breaking points on it and start to really speak out.
And to some extent, I'm not saying that COVID, even before the vaccines, was like the movie that you watched, but COVID was much closer to the movie that you watched before the vaccines than it is now. And another way to make that point is, look, before we had vaccines, when someone who was 70 years old or someone who had underlying health issues, when people like that were, for them, when COVID presented a threat that was more serious than anything else that we confront in life, then there is a really strong argument for masking, not just for them, but for the rest of us to protect them. The vaccines have completely changed the calculus on this. The vaccines provide an enormous amount of protection. Statistically, they provide the most protection for the elderly, even though they don't provide complete protection. And so I think it's a version of what you're saying. Now that we're at the point where anyone who chooses to protect themselves from this horrible virus with these extremely effective vaccines can do so. And if you're someone who's gotten the vaccines but haven't been boosted, I would urge you, do all the research you can on boosting. Boosting saves lives. And so because people can protect themselves, because the people who are suffering the worst of COVID today are overwhelmingly choosing to expose themselves by not being vaccinated, that puts us in a different situation in terms of, say, should we be asking 6-year-olds to wear masks?
Hey, thanks so much for watching. If you like what you just saw, hit the subscribe button for more clips and full episodes.